Listen to the voices of the advocates.
And if we can begin by thanking you, Mr. Robert Richter KC, for being on Advocates, the podcast.
My pleasure.
Mr. Richter, we normally start by asking people about their backgrounds, where they came from, but I'd like to ask you this. You are the only advocate we have interviewed who has his name tattooed on a client's chest. What does that feel like?
That was done without permission. Yes, I do believe it. And the photo that I saw sometime later had on top of the one breast my name, Robert Richter. On the other breast, it had not guilty. And in the middle, it had Occam's razor.
Okay.
Would you believe it? This is from a supposedly really leading man in certain circles. But the Occam's razor comes in very handy because, as you would appreciate, it's a philosophical concept that goes back to probably the 13th century, if not about the 13th century, which tells you that the simplest explanation that accommodates known facts is likely to be the true one. In other words, and I've used that as a sort of example of cutting through what some people might call bullshit, and I just call dross, in order to get to the issue. I've always used it, and although Sun Tzu in The Art of War doesn't use it, he does go to the heart of the matter very quickly.
Yes. We'll come to Sun Tzu in just a minute, but let me now just wind back because you've got a really interesting background as to how you arrived in the law. And I'd like to begin by asking you if you could tell us a little bit of the life you remember in Kyrgyzstan with your parents.
I don't remember any of it. We were sort of escaping from the Soviet Union in February of 1946 when I was born. And by the time, I don't know where the hell we were. I've never had a birth certificate. I only rely on hearsay of what people tell me, and that's not always reliable. I was 6 weeks old when we went on a train leaving Soviet Union through Poland and ended up in a refugee camp with my parents and my sister in 1946, where we stayed for about 3 years waiting for a US visa that never arrived. So I can't tell you anything about Kyrgyzstan. All I can tell you is that I speak the Yiddish language because that was the language of my parents. After 3 years in Germany, my parents, who couldn't find a visa to go to the US or whatnot, decided that since we were by birth Jewish, we went to Israel. And that was in 1949 when I was 3. And we were there until grade 7 in 1959, the middle of 1959 when we left, and went to join my uncle, my father's brother, who was living in Australia and had established a small sweatshop, and we came up there to join him. So my only language was Hebrew. I understood English language only to the extent that I'd seen Westerns on television and advertisements, and the words were yes, no, and Coca-Cola, which has a story behind it anyway, because when we flew, which took 3 days to Australia, and I asked for a Coca-Cola, and I was given it, I spat it out, it was far too sweet, and I'd never had a Coca-Cola since. But I knew yes and no.
Well, I'm glad they're not our sponsors, Richter. Yes. Now, let me ask you about learning English, because I understand you picked up a dictionary and that just marched your way through it.
Well, there was a bit more than that. There was television at that stage, black and white. And I used to watch television, of course, because it was a miracle introduction to me. I'd never seen it before. And it was in English, and the things that I couldn't understand, I mean, as language developed, because I was halfway through year 7 when I went to a state school in Melbourne, and nobody spoke Hebrew or Yiddish in that school because Hebrew became my mother tongue. What happened was that there was one Jewish student at that school, and he was assigned to look after me because they assumed he could speak to me and he couldn't. but we played chess. So I sort of learnt English by watching television. Perry Mason, there was an English drama called Boyd QC, as I remember it, and it was, I'd watch those things and look up words in the dictionary and look up their proper pronunciation. So it was a labour. And the following year, when I went to a high school, I really didn't speak very much. I was terribly reserved for those 2 years because, number one, I was ashamed of whether or not I was pronouncing words right. Number two, I wasn't sure that I had the words right. But by the time I reached year 11, I started gaining confidence. And by the time I reached year 12, I had plenty of confidence. And we had good teachers. And these were not private schools. I refused to go to a private school, and we couldn't afford it anyway. But we had some magic teachers. There was one who was teaching modern history, who was himself a Latvian refugee, and I still remember his name. And he stretched my mind to the point that in year 12, when I was doing my modern history paper, I came top of the state. So that wasn't bad. I picked up some English.
Right, a little bit. Let's come back to that in just a second. But following from that, your use of the dictionary, I understand that you have Dr. Samuel Johnson's chair in your chambers. Is that right?
I do. At least that's what
how did you come? And how did you come across that?
Oh, a friend of mine who was an antique dealer was retiring, and he said to me that I've always looked at that chair, and because it says it was made by Chippendale in 1764, etc., and a few other things in gold lettering that faded. And he said, "I'll let you have it for what I paid for it." And that was back in the 80s, early 80s, at Sotheby's in London. And he took out the invoice, and I paid him what he paid then, which was a fraction of what it's worth, I think.
Yeah.
But it's going to a museum, so it doesn't matter. One day. Okay. I'm still sitting in it now and then.
Very interesting. So let me ask you, your teacher in year 12, clearly an inspiration for you. Your path to the law.
The English teacher who recited Shakespeare right the way through. And he was a real authoritarian, but he knew his stuff amazingly well. So I did very well in the government school at the end and got into law arts, which at that stage was not compulsory. You could do law if you wanted to, but I wanted to broaden horizons, and I went into law arts. Now, a second degree is essential in Melbourne in any event.
Yeah.
But
let me ask you, sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine.
No, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, let me ask you, the topping the state in history, and I find that interesting because a lot of the advocates that we've spoken to, history has been one of their initial loves and disciplines. Why did you not pursue that rather than law?
Well, I did pursue history as well in the arts degree, you see. Mind you, I spent most of my time with the arts faculty people during those years because, number one, I found the people more attractive and attentive. And number two, in those days at the law school, there was a real class thing because, and that changed when I came to the university because the Labor government introduced scholarship schemes which made it possible for people who didn't have the money to study law. But I've never lost my love of history, and law was a discipline that I was drawn to because I'd watched television and I'd watched Boyd QC cross-examine witnesses, and I thought this looks good.
And how did you sort of having that sort of a double degree, law and then the interest in history? Why and how did you start gravitating towards law rather than history?
Well, I'd actually finished my formal education, including a clerkship, which in those days was compulsory. You had to be a clerk for 12 months. I got myself admitted to the Supreme Court of Victoria, which allowed me to get admitted in other places and to practice in the High Court and Federal Court. And I think it was about the day after I got admitted that I left Australia and went wandering around for about a year and a half. And until the money ran out, And then I had to try and find a job. And the only place I could find a job at that stage, I'd been traveling, staying in Paris and London and Rome, etc. I ended up in Jerusalem, where because of my Hebrew, which I'd maintained, I was able to get a job as a translator and editor with the Israeli news service. So that was interesting. And I spent time there. And when I came back to Australia in 1971, my old firm had said, would you like to come back? I didn't have, I had sort of pins in my bottom. I couldn't sit still. I wanted to do something. So I decided to go to the bar because I'd always, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. When I was doing law, my gods were the lecturers, and I always thought that it was a wonderful thing if I could become an academic, constitutional law, etc., etc. But that did not, that of course meant you had to have connections, and I came from a background in which I'd not known any other lawyers, basically, apart from the people with whom I did my articles of clerkship. So I came back from overseas. I was restless, and I thought, I'll give the bar a go, and I did. So I signed up to the bar, and that was in 1971, which puts me in my 52nd year now of being a barrister.
Wow.
And I knew no one, basically. But I had the enormous good fortune to be assigned to a barrister called Ronald Caston. Ron Caston. At that stage, he had just qualified for the period in which he could have a pupil, so he had me. And instead of the usual 6 months, I stayed in his chambers for 12. And he was an extraordinary man. He had independent wealth, but he had the mind that led him to be president of the Council for Civil Liberties. I did succeed him at some later stage, etc. And he taught me everything. And he let me stay in his chambers for 12 months without rent, which was wonderful, and introduced me to a couple of people. But of course, they were not wonderful constitutional cases. You had to do whatever came, which meant car crashes and negligence and this and that and the other, and the occasional drunk drivers and the occasional armed robber and drug addict. So that's how I started. I had big dreams of being a constitutional lawyer, but it became clear that that was not something you could choose. It chose you because you happened to be at the right time, at the right place, and that's how careers develop.
And let me ask you what the Melbourne bar was like in those days, in the early 70s. Was it very blue-blooded? Was it very difficult for someone from outside the charm circle to make it?
In some ways, but at that stage, having gone to the bar, that was, we're talking about Vietnam War days. We're talking about a lot of people who, because of the Whitlam scholarship scheme, came into practicing law because they had scholarships. And so there was a significant component of what you might call radical lawyers. I think it's a much misused name, but there were people whose passion was for justice. And that usually meant criminal justice. And there are a lot of them. The bar was small. I think there was, under 400 barristers or something like that, fewer than 400. And no one had specialized in criminal law. And I hadn't chosen to specialize in criminal law. I sort of fell into it by misadventure almost and stayed with it.
So tell us a little bit about that misadventure. How did that happen? How did you get drawn towards the criminal bar rather than the commercial constitutional bar?
Well, I had, once I'd left my pupillage, you would take any briefs that came and you would work on them. But we did have a social conscience. We did establish or I was part of the group that established a free legal service, a Fitzroy legal service. And those were things that were quite unknown in those days. We were the first, basically. And so as part of that, there was a fair bit of pro bono work to do with people who were victims of the criminal law. And I did a fair bit of that. And I got a brief into an armed robbery trial that was an interesting one in the sense that the man who was charged had allegedly made a confession. This was in the days when they did not tape record anything except a staged reading back of something, which ended up saying, oh, no, I won't sign it. It's all true, but I'm not going to sign it because, But anyway, that during that trial, which involved one of the robbers being shot, it attracted the attention of a man who was a doctor called Bertram Weiner. And he had become a sort of small person's ombudsman to whom people directed complaints of miscarriages of justice, abuse of process, abuse of power by the police and the like. And he put together a whole series of files. Well, he asked me if I was interested in working or trying to help out. And I said, of course. And we did. And over the period of a couple of years, we came across some very interesting files and agitated for an independent judicial inquiry to take place. And that took time. We put together a team of people who were all of the same mind and who were working on it. And by the time it came to that, when the inquiry was actually initiated, and it went for 2 years, I had yellowing paperwork briefs, which I was sending back because I didn't like the paperwork. The one thing I didn't like, I liked reading transcripts and I liked reading documents and analyzing them, but not doing the paperwork. So there were briefs on my windowsill that were yellowing for the drafting of interrogatories and the like. And anyway, once the inquiry had got going, and that took up, as I say, took 2 years of my life, from 74 to 76, I basically stayed with criminal practice because I realized that the skills that I had learned from my master, my pupil master, Ron Caston, who was the man who created the Marburg decision. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he was the man who did it on indigenous land rights, etc. The Marburg decision. He died young, unfortunately, but he was it. In any event, what he did teach me, which was important, was you look at legislation carefully and you construe legislation. And I sort of developed a practice even before the inquiry of looking for whether or not the legislation had been properly complied with and so on. For example, in drug cases, whether a certificate was right and admissible or not. And I'd had good fortune because he had trained me in that discipline in a way that inspired me. And I think I produced at least a dozen amendments to the Poisons Acts in order to overcome all sorts of things that resulted in dismissals. So I was reasonably successful in that way and stuck with crime because I considered that criminal law had technical aspects to it, like any other branch of the law. But for me, it was important because when you're representing someone whose liberty is at stake, I just felt by my history and upbringing and all that compelled to persist, which I did.
And can I ask, apart from Caston, did you have anyone else who were your teachers in those early years at the bar?
There were no teachers, but I was terribly fortunate to score a brief, which was a brief in a conspiracy to import a very large amount of drugs into Australia. And it was a legal aid brief, of course, which meant that I was paid a third of what a commercial lawyer would have charged at my level of seniority or any level. And I ran that case. One of the co-accused was represented by a man called Jack Lazarus. And he had tenacity like I've never seen before. The trial went for 3 months. I thought I did a pretty good job. We were both acquitted, to which I said, did I do all right? And he said, all right. Yeah, not bad. And that was it. But he taught me that you could ask a question in 5 or 6 different ways and get to where you needed to get. So that's what we did. And he was my inspiration, really. Unfortunately, he died at an early age of 74. He was a communist member, but he had tenacity and he had flexibility of mind that I just found wonderful. So that was the first big trial I'd ever done. And I thought that taught me more than anything. After 3 months of doing that, I used to come home to my wife every night and say, Jesus, I'm learning the trade and they're even paying me.
Can I just explore that phrase you used, asking a question in 5 different ways to get to where you want
Yeah.
to? Could you just
Yeah.
expand on that and just tell our listeners what you mean by that?
You ask someone, how far was so-and-so when you saw XYZ? Okay? That immediately implants the notion of far. Okay? You get one answer. If you were to ask, now, how near was he or she? You may get a different answer. There are different perceptions, and you can formulate your questions in different ways, which require different aspects of the answer, and sometimes you can steer it in that way. You can focus it by refining it. So you're asking in different ways, but hopefully you get to where you want. My last exercise of this was dealing with a pathologist, well, an expert in forensic medicine, actually, not pathologist, and it had to do with the age of bruises. And you could ask questions 15 different ways. I didn't have to, because he foresaw that there were certain things that were undeniable and indisputable as being conclusive in any event. So you open the sort of gateway of, well, it's reasonably possible that this or that happened. So it depends on how you approach it and how you go about it. But going back to Sun Tzu, you study the territory first.
Right.
Sun Tzu's Art of War tells you study the temperature, the climate, the movement, you study everything. It's a very short book, but I recommend it to everyone who wants to go into battle.
So tell us, if you can now, let's deal with Sun Tzu before we move on, but tell us now, how has that informed your advocacy?
Well, it formed my advocacy in the sense of it's being strategic. I've never been very good with memorizing dates, memorizing names and remembering them and so on. I work thematically. And so in order to work thematically, you have to formulate a strategy. You have to formulate some case concept that allows you to formulate a strategy to fit it. That is, consistently with instructions, which you do not make up, because you don't do that. My friend Jack Lazarus, when he got a brief, the first thing he'd do is tear it up and throw it in the basket and then ask the client, did you do this? Did you do that? Da, 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 da. But he would get instructions that way, which was very interesting. But the art of war just basically tells you that where you are facing larger forces, for example, a prosecution team with great resources, you need to create a strategy which would focus your strength at a place where they're not strong, where it's penetrable. Can't overdo Sun Tzu in that way, because Sun Tzu, you don't fight wars that way, but the basic principles were laid out by him millennia ago.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Now, let me then ask about your early days at the bar. I know you took silk at your 14th year of call, which is quick by any standards. But
it was.
Yeah, but defense and prosecution, did you have a preference between the two?
I had a preference in 2 ways. Number one, I expressed my preferences to prosecuting people whose laws I thought were appalling. The drug laws in particular, the prostitution laws, the consorting laws, they were vile and evil laws. And a good deal of them have remained that way, drug laws in particular, and the kind of the way they're formulated. And you, coming from Malaysia, of course, would appreciate that you still have capital punishment. In fact, I did a case in Malaysia, but it wasn't a criminal case. Well, it was a criminal case. It was an insider trading case, which was the first ever in Malaysia's history,
Really?
although they'd had legislation for 10 years. But that was interesting. So my choice of whether I prosecuted or defended, it was quite clear to people that there were certain types of legal structures that were anathema to me. So they wouldn't call on me. On the other hand, I was called in to prosecute quite a number of things like white-collar frauds, conspiracies to defraud the tax department, and I was never shy to accept those. One of my other interesting briefs was to do, there was an act that was passed called the War Crimes Act, which dealt with old war crimes. I was then at that stage Vice President of the Council for Liberties Act and objected to the production of that piece of legislation because it essentially was legislation for the losers. In other words, war crimes act committed in the Second World War by the Japanese, the Germans, their associates, etc. They were fine to prosecute, but you couldn't prosecute other people who committed war crimes. Okay, so but I was briefed to look at 6 files of people who were in Australia as to whether or not there was enough material to prosecute. Now, I did prosecute conspiracies, tax conspiracies, and the like. And got a fair run of success because there were interesting cases. But what I did find was this, that when I put on my prosecutor's hat, I felt a far graver responsibility than when in those days I put on my defense counsel's wig. We have wigs anymore. And that meant that whatever I did, I had to do a double take on myself. In other words, I had to say to myself, is this fair? Is it appropriate? I'll never forget a case. I prosecuted 2 accountants for a conspiracy to defraud the tax. And in terms of disclosure principles in those days, there weren't that many. But I was asked whether there was anything that I should disclose in terms of it might be of assistance to the defense. And I actually told the people who briefed me, there is a room here where all the documents are kept. Please have free access to it. And they did. The fact that they missed a crucial document that I didn't know about till the trial had started and it got going, and during cross-examination of the defense, I'd missed it, they'd missed it, but it was crucial and pretty significant. But I'd never, if I did prosecute, and I have prosecuted, it would be on the basis that I would always question myself as to whether what I was doing was proper, whether what I was doing lived up to the best traditions of you must disclose that which is against your interest if it's there. Let them do what they can with it, but you must disclose it. So I found prosecuting doubly difficult in that sense.
Yeah, I guess it's that sense of responsibility and power that you're exercising as a prosecutor, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, that weight.
I prosecuted BHP, BHP for blowing up gasworks in Victoria, killing a couple of people, etc. And we had to have full disclosure, and we did disclose. It's just that I think I consulted a better expert than they did. We got that convicted.
Tell us now about this, the race that you had to silk in 14 years. How did that happen?
To 14 years? It was interesting. I was doing a couple of armed robbery trials. And one of the interesting things about an armed robbery trial that I did was that it went for a long time because I was cross-examining and digging around in a way that was very interesting. I thought would be very interesting, and it went for a long time. During that trial, the bar being small and collegiate in those days, we had a room up on the 3rd floor with long tables, with a lot of people. The trial judge, who was sitting at the other end at some stage, was heard to say something like, barristers who practice in crime are eating out of the garbage pails of the law. Now, I took that to heart, ran the trial as hard as I could. We did get an acquittal. Prior to that, I'd done another trial that I was proud of, and these judges are deceased now, but Justice Stark, who was a Supreme Court judge of great eminence, said to me, you should apply for silk. And that was when I'd been 13 years at court, and he said, you won't get it first time around, but get your foot in the door. So I did. By the time it came to the second application, I decided that I would nominate as one of my referees the judge who said that about the garbage pails of the law. I nominated another one who was my favorite judge in the Court of Criminal Appeal then, a fellow called William Crockett, after whose name my chambers are called, our chambers are called. But I nominated this other judge on the basis of, let's see if the man is honest. Because if he's honest, he'll write a report that says that was a brilliant trial because we did extremely well in a total loss situation. And true to his form, whatever he said, he must have recommended me. So it came through.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Let me ask now about working as a silk compared to as a junior at the bar. Was there a significant difference between the two?
There was for me, especially in later years. I mean, it is no longer compulsory to have a junior as junior counsel for silk. But I still insist on having junior counsel for silk because you want someone you can discuss things professionally and at depth. In a number of years leading after I took silk, that didn't mean that I had to do a lot of paperwork. I still didn't. It meant I had to do a fair bit of reading, but I would delegate a whole lot of reading to people and say, well, what's being said here? And to people that I trusted to summarize things properly for me so that I would see where things are going. Changed in the, since the mid-90s in particular and thereafter, because there were some very serious changes to the Criminal Procedure Act, which almost made it a paper practice. The one thing we didn't do in Victoria anyway was to abolish committal proceedings, which was an extraordinarily important thing not to do. And it still exists, but committal proceedings still exists. But later on, as paperwork came to the fore, prosecution openings, written responses, all sorts of issues on evidentiary matters where notice had to be given, submissions had to be prepared, and so on and so forth. I would be very happy to delegate those, the drafting, to junior barristers whom I trusted and whose work I reviewed. And if I settled it, I settled it. So it's changed in that way. It's become much more of a paper practice, especially when you're thinking in terms of the prosecutions of sex offences.
Right.
There are all sorts of limitations on what you can and cannot do, the questions you can and cannot ask without leave. Leave is to be sought by a formal application. You subpoena certain documents, you have to prepare submissions and all the rest of it. So it's become much more of a paper-based practice, and the judge will look at the papers and can't help but formulate some feelings about it or some views, which then have to be litigated orally at some stage, unless people agree. So it's changed in that way. It's become much more. See, it's hard to say commercial practice because it's not that I don't do commercial practice. I just do criminal commercial practice. and the criminal aspects of it go into all elements of corporate responsibility, corporate criminality, and the like. So you do need to know not commercial law as in business, but corporate law as it affects the conduct of company directors, accountants, other people.
Sure. Duties and liabilities type thing.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to spend the last part of the interview. We've got about 20 minutes left. I'm going to spend about 10, 15 minutes on, obviously, that you've got an arm's length of interesting and famous cases. But I do want to ask you first about your approach to work. And the first thing I'd like to ask you about is the cab rank rule. And I've read that is something that is very sacred to you. Tell us why.
Well, because people who need defending are not always nice people. In fact, most of the time they're not, but they're entitled to their rights. And if they have a brief which is being offered and you look at the brief and you say to yourself, I have no conflicts and I am available for this, it's your duty to say, I'll do my best, unless it is something in which you are personally embarrassed And even if you are, and you say, listen, I remember acting for some German clients who were involved in a meat substitution racket. And one of the tape recorded episodes that occurred was a celebration of Hitler's birthday. And the man was very embarrassed. I didn't even raise it. He said to me, oh, look, that was just a joke. And I said, I don't care whether it was a joke or not. We're not dealing with Hitler or the Second World War. We are dealing with this particular issue. So, you know, it doesn't colour the way I approach things and won't colour the way I approach things. But I do think that the cab rank principle is important and ought to be honoured where possible. And because it's the fact that you have access to people of expertise. You're not thrown on partisans or people who don't have the expertise in order to uphold your rights.
Let me then ask you about your approach to work. And I think you've spoken about how you prefer trials to appeals, and of course you do appeals. Cardinal Pell was one that went all the way to the High Court.
I tell you what, my application for Silk was based on appellate work, basically. I used to do an enormous amount of appellate work, a lot of appellate work, and my principal referee was, as I said, Bill Crockett, who used to deputise as running the Court of Criminal Appeal. And I used to love appeals, but once I'd got involved in long-running criminal trials, that became too difficult and so on.
Right.
So the way that I forgot the question, but that's okay. I hope you remember it.
Yeah, I hadn't come there yet. I was going to ask you. So let's just turn to the appeals for a minute, and obviously that you tell us that was the bedrock of your application for Silk. What was your approach to appeals? Was it a single point?
Well, if you could find the still point in the turning world, you were doing well.
Right.
It's not always a single point. It's usually an accumulation. If it's a single point, it stands out in the sense that it's an error.
Yeah.
But the Pell appeal, by the way, I did not conduct the appeal. I conducted the second trial. But
right.
I'm proud to say that the arguments that were raised and run after he was convicted were precisely the arguments that I put to the jury in practically the sequence and the reasoning. So I was really pleased, but I felt very upset when the conviction occurred because I thought this is perverse. There you go.
Come to that.
And being upset, I could not bring the kind of objectivity to an appeal that one needed.
I found that really interesting, actually. Sorry, but that one of the things that your approaches to work is that you rather not do the appeals because you feel that it needs a fresh mind.
Yeah, well, I do my own appeals where I've got a clear vision of what I think is right. I don't do them if I've developed a particular like or dislike for the thing. And that's got nothing to do with the cab rank principle. It has to do with saying, look, I'm not sold on this, and maybe you could do somebody else. That can happen. If they insist, I'll do it.
Right.
But,
I'm just interested in that because I think what it obviously needs is a sense of self-awareness that perhaps we as advocates don't always have. We're as outward looking and not so much inward looking. I just find that very interesting.
Well, I'm glad you do, because that's my nature, unfortunately.
Yeah. So now let's turn to your approach to trial work. Brief lands on Robert Richter QC's desk. How do you get up that case through to preparing for cross-examination?
Well, first of all, you read the papers you have. Second, having got the brief, you decide what you need to subpoena and what might turn up and what might not turn up. Third, having assessed the case, you formulate a sort of case concept about the way you'd like it to run, so that my approach to criminal trials is that by the time I deliver an opening, I'd like it to foreshadow the closing that I want to make. In other words, I I have a closing in mind, a final address in mind, and I will work towards it. We have the advantage now of being able to have a defense opening, which is limited, but it consists in the way that you construct it. If you construct it by way of a series of questions that arise as issues, and you say, look, there are really 10 issues in this case. Did X, C, Y? Did da, 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 da. You formulate them as questions. Juries are very attentive to questions and dot points. And in fact, in the old days, and I still do from time to time, you tell a jury that they're, of course, free to take notes. There will be a transcript and all the rest of it, but they're free to record their thinking. And if I say in an opening, for example, there are 10 issues that arise in this case, and they are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You generally notice that at least some of the jury, if it's a jury trial, will write them down. And then what you'd like, and you do it conservatively with the foresight of what you believe you can achieve by way of examination, cross-examination. So that by the time you get to do your final address, you're saying, you remember what I said at the opening? Now let's see how that went. And you start ticking them off. So that's my preferred way, which is if you've analysed the case and you've formulated an appropriate case concept, that's the way a trial should run. Of course, you have to be flexible because quite a lot of the time it won't. And so it's at that stage that you need to show a flexibility of mind and be able to do a swing that won't destroy you.
Yeah. So can I just summarize it just for our listeners in this way, that what you need to do is be so clear-eyed before you utter a word that you know exactly what evidence it is that you're going to get?
Well, you're never sure about the evidence you're going to get. Some things you can be sure of because you'll have the transcript of the depositions and what people have sworn to, but you also know that they diverge from them, and then the cross-examination progresses somewhat differently, trying to get them back to it, or say, okay, well, that was a lie. Okay, so let's assume this is true. Why do you say this, that, and so on?
That flexibility. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me then ask you now about cross-examination itself. Do you sit there and plot it by writing every single question down, or is it thematic?
Never. What I used to have some friends who were prosecutors, professional prosecutors, and I remember one of them in particular, who I won't name. He used to do a kind of cross-examination tree, and some defense counsel too. I'll ask this question. If the answer is yes, I'll go there. If the answer is no, I'll go there. My thinking on cross-examination is always thematic. What is the theme that I would like to be able to pursue, and what can I must to support it and to weaken the other branch? So it's always thematic, which is, as I say, I don't have a great memory for names and addresses and dates and so on and so forth, but it's the theme that matters to me always. And when I formulate my case, it has to be thematically formulated as to the way I would like it to go, leaving open the possibility that if it goes a particular way, you try and hedge it back. But it's never planned in advance. And my other approach to cross-examination, unlike Cicero's admonition never to ask a question unless you know the answer. That came from Cicero.
I didn't know that. No.
Right. That was Cicero's dictum. The fact is, I will ask questions when I'm not sure what the answer will be, but I will do it on a calculated basis where I have a fallback position if I don't get the answer I need. So it's impossible to predict accurately But if you have thematically analysed the evidence you have and the possible explanations and all the rest of it, then you are able to be flexible. And the people who do use coloured pencils for the yes, no, etc., that's the one thing they don't have. They do not have the flexibility for the unexpected.
Yeah.
And the unexpected
Yes.
arises. It
Yeah.
arises more often than one expects. But
Mm.
you ask questions having calculated the risks of what you can get and can't get. The people who say don't ask a question unless you know the answer belong to a different school from my school. My school is you weigh up the probabilities.
Yeah.
You don't expect certain answers. And if you get an unexpected answer, you try and work your way around it. But there are times when you have to take a risk, but it has to be a calculated risk, and you have to have a good reason for taking it.
Okay. Okay. Very interesting. Thank you. Let's now turn to some of the big cases, the high-profile cases that you've done. And I'd like you to tell our listeners, and I mean, George Pell obviously is the most recent of the very famous cases internationally that you've done. How your use of Occam's razor applies to these high-profile cases that attract so much publicity, so much criticism, so many partisan views.
I think it applies to any complex case. It applies to any complex case. The gentleman who had my name tattoos across his chest, there was a whole lot of evidence, but ultimately it depended on a pretty interesting analysis of ballistics and the firearms and what they do and how they do it. And you came to the conclusion that having looked at the material, you were able to cross-examine into a position where the expert had to agree that the lethal shot was a final shot and it had to be fired effectively in the course of a physical fight. Why? No one saw it, but there it is. I looked at the firearm. It had a loose cylinder, slightly loose. It was a worn firearm. And when I looked at the T-shirt that the deceased had, there were two areas of blackening, which was very interesting because one of them, of course, was gunshot residue and blackening from the muzzle, but the other was from the cylinder, which meant that the weapon had to be held like that to the chest. Now, my client was quite a large man. The other fellow, although he was a professional killer, as we could now say, because we now know, he was the one with the gun. But it came down to Occam's razor because there were a number of shots fired all around. And because when the gun was photographed and you could see that there was a missed pin, one of the rounds did not go off, you knew that the next one had to be the last shot because you knew the way the cylinder revolved, etc., etc. So it was a clear exercise in logic of saying, this is what's happened. Here are 5 fired shots. Here is one in which the pin missed the center because, and of course you're able to say that was because there was a struggle and there was pressure applied.
Yeah.
So it wasn't an assassination where my client invited the guy to come in and then shot him. It was quite different.
Right.
So and that's an explanation of how you cut through to things. Pell case, Occam's razor said, look, by the way, when the case started, before the committal hearing, and we're blessed to have committal hearings, you don't have them in Malaysia, as I understand it, and we have limited them in some of our jurisdictions to the point where they are meaningless and become nothing. But when we got the brief and looked at it, there was nothing that told us how it was that the alleged victim got to where he was. And so having studied the history of the man, having studied a bit of Catholic history, having studied liturgy, having studied the way things go in processions on a large mass, I was able to draw from witnesses things that they never even considered. In other words, when there is a Sunday mass, a high mass, etc., at the cathedral, it's all orchestrated. It's theatre. It's theological theatre. Okay, there are processions, and you go in a particular way, and there are certain people who have particular functions and things like that. No one had analysed that case in that way to show that where and how the alleged victim got to where he said he was raped orally just wasn't possible. And we had established that basically by cross-examination at the committal, which was very fortunate. And we were able to follow through the trial. The first trial miscarried because there was a disagreement in the end after days of retirement. In the second trial, I couldn't understand how the verdict was arrived at. Although, interestingly enough, I might add that it was one of the first juries that I had ever encountered where once the jury had been selected, every member of that jury took an oath rather than make an affirmation.
Really?
Right? Yes. Extraordinary to me it was. But there you are. And I don't think anyone expected the verdict in the end, including the press corps, including the other people who were there, including some of the officers of the court, I might add. But it happens. And it was not something that I could live with happily or take on with a cool mind in terms of an appeal.
An appeal.
So
Okay.
That's what happened.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. We now come to
one of my more interesting cases, though, involved appearing in Malaysia.
Yeah, tell us about that. Do tell us about that.
In the 90s, it was a Chinese billionaire who ran an outfit that produced ceramics and tiles and so on and so forth. And I got the brief because it was after I had a significant victory in a case where a future Prime Minister of Australia was charged with being was charged with stealing 73 million from an agricultural company, etc., etc. Anyway, we won that. But apparently what happened was that one of the people who'd been to law school with me was a Malaysian student who'd become a magistrate after that. And she thought that there was an English silk who was asked for an opinion about the insider trading case, which was the first in Malaysian history. And there was a 3-page document or something that came back, which I think mixed up companies and mixed up a few other things and cost 30,000 sterling to produce. And she suggested to her client back in Malaysia that he approached me. So he did, and we did. And it was a fantastic process. It taught me a lot about the Malaysian system. I hope it's changed because I recall writing, saying that there were, and giving a lecture to an advocate seminar in Cebu, that there were certain things that had to be changed. You could not proceed in a district court trial without having a transcript, number one. And there weren't any because the record of the trial was, and I hope still isn't, but I suspect still is, the notes of the judge.
That's changed. That has changed.
Thank goodness for that. I'm so pleased.
Yeah, that has changed. So it's now recorded transcripts. Yeah.
That is so important and critical. But there are no preliminary hearings, you see.
No.
So you cannot explore things in a preliminary way, and you have to take risks that you wouldn't otherwise have to take.
Yes.
But that process went for a year, on again, off again, because it was a judge-alone trial. And my client didn't go to jail in the end, which was nice because we actually had no-cased it at the district court level. We no-cased it at the close of the prosecution case. There was an appeal to the High Court. His Lordship found otherwise and said, no, we call for the defence, at which stage we decided, listen, neither you nor we can afford to lose anything. You're asking for us to go to jail for 10 years. I don't think that's appropriate and right. How about we narrow it all down to X, Y, Z, and you pay a small fine, and we all say goodbye. So rather than go through the whole appellate process, we resolved it in that way.
Right.
Well, it's highly satisfactory in every way.
Did you enjoy yourself in Malaysia?
I loved it. We were in Kuching,
Yeah, you love
and
beautiful place. Yeah,
Ching was wonderful.
yeah.
And then I, as I say, I was invited to give a talk to a gathering of lawyers. Oh, by the way, to get my ad hoc license took
Mm,
me all the way to the High Court and all the rest of it, because there were
yeah,
great
yeah.
objections. Uh,
Always
another
are.
another Australian lawyer who wanted to represent a couple of people who were charged with capital crimes said that he wanted to, and he was a great master of the criminal law, and he was refused permission to have an ad hoc license because they said that they had plenty of experience in executing people.
Yeah, yeah,
Mind
yeah. It's
you,
very difficult.
I think my winning point was to say that I'd had experience in dealing with the legislation for insider trading, whereas none of them in Malaysia had any. And of
This is the
course, I
first case.
undertook
Yeah,
to employ local lawyers who
yeah,
would learn,
yeah.
etc. And after a battle, they said, "Okay, you can go and do it." So I did, and
Excellent.
loved it.
I think Michelle had something to ask.
Yes, Mr. Richter, over your 51 years at the bar, I think you would have seen, quite a few notable changes in practice. But for me, I think the change in forensics, that, the techniques and the technology and the paperwork, you've said that, there's increasingly a lot more paperwork now. How have these two changes affected practice in general? I mean, in your practice, has it made things more complicated? Or is it easier?
It's required greater study. For example, if you're talking about forensics and you're talking about DNA and you're talking about all sorts of other techniques, and DNA techniques are still changing and expanding significantly. It's not like fingerprint days. It's quite different, and people give you astronomical figures as statistics, which really don't mean much in a lot of the cases. Yes, okay, so there's 100 billion chance to one that this is the else. And you say, well, how many galaxies have you been to that have had 1 billion people and 100 billion people on them to make the... It doesn't matter. You need to study the literature because the forensics are critical and always have been, and can get you either convicted or acquitted. So it's very, very important. And it has changed in that way because it's become a discipline that you need to know enough about to be able to cross-examine people who are experts at analysing DNA. The expertise has developed an awful lot. The case I'm still involved in involves the disappearance of Mr. Chappell off a yacht in Tasmania, and there's a High Court special leave application coming up, which is very much dependent on DNA, and, well, we'll see how that goes.
Yeah,
But
that is very big. We turn now to our closing chapter, which is what we call the rapid fire round. So we ask these series of questions, and a quick and rapid answer is what we're looking for.
I'll do my best.
First one. If there was a case you would go back and re-argue, which one would it be?
I would re-argue the one of the disappearance of the man from the yacht in Tasmania, and I would re-argue it quite differently if I was fighting it as a trial.
Second, what do you enjoy most in practice? The intellectual exercise or the interpersonal skills?
Oh, I think it's the intellectual exercise, basically. The interpersonal skills I reserve for my friends.
Who is the opponent that you... And family, of course. Who's the opponent that you respected the most?
Oh, look, there was a prosecutor whose ethics were outstanding. His name is Gavin Silbert. He's a QC. He was employed at the DPP as senior prosecuting counsel. I always found his ethics to be impeccable and right. So I've always admired him as a prosecutor and respected him. There aren't many that I can say that about, but he's a pinnacle.
So in your 51 years at the bar, who would you say you learnt the most from?
I still go back to the 70s. I learned most from Jack Lazarus because I thought he was an extraordinary advocate. He was wonderful in many, many ways. He was a very small man, but he was persistent but incisive. I said before that he'd be a member of the Communist Party and there were all splits and this and that and the other, and forget about that. And his wife used to say, she was a property developer, she used to say, you know nothing, Jack, whatever. The fact is, I learned that you had to study the terrain and you had to have a flexible mind in organizing your tactics. And I
Excellent.
think and the one who taught me most technically was Ron Caston, I think, because he taught me about the value of statutory construction, what you could make of it, and where you could fly through it, if possible.
Okay. The judge who challenged you the most?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I think that was the very judge whom I then recommended for Silk, because we had stand-up brawls. We had stand-up brawls. And we still do from no, I mean, he's gone. But we had stand-up brawls. That was the severest challenge I've experienced.
That's Crockett. Justice Crockett.
I had to do a double take thinking, am I going the wrong way completely or am I going crazy? No.
Okay. What is the single most important quality in an advocate?
Compassion and understanding and devotion to mastering the facts and knowing the law. There is no single factor. You have to do all that.
Right. And lastly, tell us about a day in the life of Robert Richter QC.
That depends on which decade you're in. At the moment, the day in my life means that if I don't have to go to court, I don't ring up a clerk and I don't ring up anyone. And I like to stay and play with my grandchildren. But the youngest one is only one, so he requires a lot of attention. So that's my favorite time. But an ordinary day, it depends whether it's a committal or a trial. And thank God, as I say, we still have committals. They're very important. So it would start, I'm not an early riser. I hate it. I work late at night, read late at night and make notes late at night. So I may go to bed at 2 or 3 and wake up at 7 if it's necessary for the day, but if it's at all possible, I'll sleep in late. So I do my best, what I consider my best work at night rather than early morning. There are people who have the stamina to get up at 5 or 6 and be ready for court at 10. My philosophy has always been, if I get up and start work and the clock is ticking, I get to a certain point in time. If I work at night, if I have to work through 24 hours, okay. If the work has to be done, it has to be done. And that used to be much more the case when I was younger and had more stamina. But my dictum was that if you're working at night, the only limit is court starting in the morning. Whereas if you start in the morning, you may have 2 or 3 hours to prepare, but then the hammer falls and you're in there. Yeah. So, but it's a question of the constitution of the person, of what they can and can't take.
And what do you do to enjoy yourself?
I like cinema, I like literature, I like music, most of all Bach.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Robert Richter. Sorry.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Robert Richter QC, for being with us on Advocates, the podcast, and for giving up your time today.
Thank you for listening to Advocates, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow us on all our social media channels. Leave a review or share this episode and tag us. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Listen to the voices of the advocate.